Many health experts would tell diabetics, don't even try to attain normal blood sugar. You'll just mess yourself up. But is that really true? Just this past week, I was interviewed by Dr. Ken Berry for his YouTube channel. It was kind of different being on the other side of an interview, but we had a good time. I'll put a link to that interview in the description. In our video today, we'll have a distinct Part A and Part B. In the first part, I'll share the story of David Dykman, who is a type 1 diabetic and is only 17 years old. David and his dad, R.D. Dykman, have worked for Dr. Richard Bernstein for about 8 years now, and young David has profited hugely from his association with the great Dr. Bernstein. Even though he's a type 1 diabetic and his pancreas makes no insulin at all, he has kept his glucose levels in a normal range year after year, which is incredible. Recently, David gave a talk and shared his story and his approach to diabetes, which is something every diabetic, whether type 1 or type 2, needs to hear. I'll share a few highlights from David's talk, and then in the second part of this video, I'll talk about type 2 diabetes and how it is that we also can attain normal blood sugar, and that our method isn't so different from David's method as a type 1. David begins by sharing that over the last 7 or 8 years maybe by now, following the plan laid out by Dr. Richard Bernstein in his book, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, David has had normal glucose levels in the 80s and an A1c in the 4s. In fact, he shares that once he began Dr. Bernstein's program, he's never had an A1c in the 5s. All his A1c scores have been lower than 5, and usually in the range of 4.5. Now, that's going to get your attention for sure if you know anything about diabetes, and you know just how hard many diabetics struggle just to get an A1c of 7. David tells how that as a boy he began feeling very sick and weak and fatigued, and he'd lost a significant amount of weight. A doctor misdiagnosed him and told him he should drink lots and lots of milkshakes to gain some weight, which of course was about the worst advice anyone could give a diabetic. Finally, he became so sick he couldn't even walk, and he was taken for more tests, and this time they figured it out, and they told him he was a type 1 diabetic. The doctor told him that high blood sugar could do a lot of damage to him, and when the doctor went on to say that it was carbohydrates that made blood sugar rise, he blurted out in childlike innocence, "Well, then I just won't eat carbs." Talk about out of the mouth of babes. However, he didn't do that at first. He did eat his carbs. In fact, while he was in the hospital for type 1 diabetes, the most severe form of diabetes, he was served pancakes, juice, French fries, and bananas. The dietitians didn't seem to have a clue. His doctor didn't seem to have a clue. And once he got home, his parents tried to follow the current ADA guidelines for how a diabetic should eat, which meant lots and lots of, quote, healthy carbs. Even though he was now taking insulin, his glucose levels were all over the map, ranging from around 400 as highs to around 50 as lows. David's remarkable transformation came when his mother discovered and ordered Dr. Richard Bernstein's book, Diabetes Solution. They knew that what they were currently doing was not working, and the book and the approach made so much sense, they immediately switched to a low-carb, high-protein diet. With David eating 30 or less grams of carbs per day and carefully giving himself the small amounts of insulin required for the low-carb meals he was now eating, well, it just began to work beautifully, and soon he was able to put an end to those highs and lows, and he began to enjoy stable blood sugar throughout each day, day after day. David's father, R.D. Dykman, ended up working for Dr. Bernstein, and David also helped out and took a keen interest in Dr. Bernstein's work. Today, even though he's only 17 years old, David Dykman is a living testimony to the power of a low-carb lifestyle. While most type 1 diabetics who are hit with the disease as children have stunted growth, David is now 6 feet 1 inches tall and plays quarterback for his high school team. He eats enjoyable food and enjoys keto foods and snacks. He says, "There is no deprivation. There is a delicious low-carb alternative to any high-carb meal." He's used trial and error methods with his favorite foods to determine precisely how much fast-acting insulin to take before his low-carb meals. And believe me, he takes a whole lot less insulin than most type 1s. When he's at parties and they're serving hot dogs and hamburgers, he'll eat the hamburger or hot dog and just skip the buns. And when he's served pizza, he'll scoop off the cheese and the toppings and eat those and skip the bread underneath. David lists his 3 motivations or goals related to diabetes as these. Number 1, to live a normal, healthy life. 2, to have normal blood sugar. And 3, to avoid hypos, which are dangerous times when blood sugar plunges way too low as a result of injecting too much insulin. So far, David is achieving all 3 of those goals masterfully. In fact, he's doing so well with the hypos, he says he cannot remember the last time he had a serious hypo. Technically, he's not on a keto diet since he eats more protein than fat and never worries about ketones. But his diet is surely working for him. Type 1 young people who keep this kind of glucose control are definitely rare, but they do exist. In fact, David is involved with a Facebook group which calls itself Type 1 Grit. In his talk, David shared a study where doctors looked at some children and youth that kept their blood sugar under control the way he does, and the conclusion of these doctors was this: their blood sugar control seemed almost too good to be true. But of course, it was true, and young people like David are an example to every one of us of what can be achieved if we ever take glucose control seriously. It's interesting, David shared a polling question where young type 1 diabetics were asked what diet was recommended to you when you were first diagnosed as diabetic. Sadly, out of all the young people that responded, 98% said they were recommended a high-carb diet. Only 2% said their doctors or nutritionists recommended that they eat a low-carb diet. At the end of his talk, David Dykman sums up what he wants to share with his audience with these words: diabetics are entitled to normal, healthy blood sugars. Wow. After hearing his story and seeing his success, you tend to believe him when he says that. Now, let me add a few remarks about this, and then we'll get on to the type 2 diabetes and some of the similarities between type 1s and type 2s and how we each can beat diabetes. David Dykman is doing something that would scare many doctors to death. He's living with a 4.5 A1c as a type 1. That is entirely opposite from the orthodox approach. Most doctors seem to feel that an A1c of 7 is about the best most diabetics can hope for, and they tend to believe that shooting for an A1c lower than 7 is not only unlikely, but in fact it is extremely dangerous if you can even make that your goal. Well, in one sense, they're right. If your idea of strictly controlling your glucose involves eating whatever you like, eating meals and foods with lots of carbs and then giving yourself insulin and more insulin, and still shooting for strict control of your glucose, well, that could do you a world of harm. Because with high-carb meals and foods, it becomes impossible to precisely measure the amount of pre-meal insulin you would need. You'll end up with crazy glucose surges and terrible and dangerous glucose plunges. So if you're aiming for an A1c in the 4s and eating lots of carbohydrates, you are playing with fire. But when you eat very few carbs, say 30 grams per day, you can much more carefully determine how much insulin to take, and even if you don't quite get it right, you still won't go way out of bounds. Now, some may wonder, why try for such a low A1c? Is this just a game? Is it a competition? No, my friend, it is no game. The reason we aim for normal blood sugar is that when you do not have normal blood sugar, when you have consistently high blood sugar, you are damaging your body every day and inviting terrible diabetic complications into your life, such as kidney failure, heart problems, blindness, amputations, infections that never heal, arthritis, and many others. Now, it may take years for them to make their terrible appearance in your life, but they are on the way. There is a tremendous benefit that comes to those who keep their glucose levels in line, and that benefit is good health, which is no small thing. All right, let's talk about type 2 diabetes. Some of you type 2s have been waiting patiently for this, and so here it is. In some ways, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are two different beasts. With type 1, your pancreas makes no insulin, and you must take insulin or you die. With type 2, normally your pancreas is making plenty of insulin. In fact, often it's being forced to pump out more insulin that is good for you. But despite the differences, there are some similarities. In both cases, you're concerned with glucose levels. That is something most non-diabetics never even think about. But if you are diabetic, you're thinking about it, or at least you should be. In both cases, if your glucose levels run too high for too much of your days, you're asking for trouble and you will surely get it. For the type 2, we often do not need, in fact, usually we don't need to inject ourselves with insulin, but we must find a way to keep our glucose levels on the low side. And with both type 1 and type 2, the real breakthrough comes when you get the revelation that you absolutely must cut those carbohydrates in your diet, and not by a little amount. As you read and research, you'll learn that most carbs are totally unhealthy for us anyway. So it's not as though you're making some great sacrifice. The truth is, when you switch from a high-carb to a low-carb diet, you're simply doing what you should have been doing all along. With the type 1, a low-carb diet ensures that they can take the proper amount of insulin to match the foods that they eat. But there is another factor. Even if you could somehow perfectly match your foods with your insulin after high-carb meals, which you can't, but even if you could, the truth is you would need to take a huge amount of insulin to cover that macaroni and cheese dinner with that big chunk of bread and that German chocolate cake. And taking all that insulin meal after meal would not be healthy. Normal insulin is a good guy, and we desperately need it. But insulin at excess levels is a good guy who has gone rogue and is now a bad guy doing bad things. One problem that most of us type 2s have, which David Dykman probably does not have, is insulin resistance. David is young, slim, and athletic. He probably doesn't have a trace of insulin resistance, no fatty liver, and no cells stuffed with sugar. But most of us type 2s who are in our 40s and beyond, with large stomachs, do have insulin resistance. And this is why we frequently need to add another tool to our tool belt, which is intermittent fasting. We need to burn that fat out of our liver and drain the sugar from our cells to reduce our insulin resistance, along with keeping our carbs to a minimum. I have to give a great big amen to David's statement, diabetics are entitled to normal, healthy blood sugars. For both groups, type 1 and type 2, it starts with a low-carb diet. For many type 2s, it will also involve time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. And for sure, it will involve taking our diabetes seriously. As I listened to David's talk, I had to admire this young man for his conscientious approach to glucose control. So many diabetics think that if they just ignore their diabetes and go right on eating as they've always eaten, and weighing what they've always weighed, and living as couch potatoes the way they always have, well, they just might get lucky and avoid any health problems. I would say not very likely. Or as Adrian Monk used to say, I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I've had a few type 1 diabetics get grumpy with me for saying we can all beat diabetes. Their thinking is, well, I'll always have to take insulin, so I cannot beat diabetes. I disagree. No, I don't disagree that they'll always need insulin. They will. But what I disagree with is their idea of what it means to beat diabetes. David Dykman is taking a couple of types of insulin every day. But in my mind, he is beating diabetes. In fact, he's crushing it. With an A1c of 4.5, with normal glucose levels at around 85, with wonderful health and a bright future, how is that not beating diabetes? So what if he has to take insulin? Taking insulin is not the end of the world, especially when you're taking minimal amounts of it due to eating low-carb meals. Dr. Richard Bernstein has been doing this for years, and he's now in his 80s, late 80s, and going strong. Well, let me close this video with a quote by Dr. Richard Bernstein, which I love. He says, "We are not doomed to share the fate of others who died prematurely after years of painful diabetic complications. With the ability to control our blood sugars comes the ability to prevent the consequences of high blood sugars."